Hello, everybody. Welcome to the CHDH. Sorry,
It's a mouthful.
Moment to get out. First, I'd just like to acknowledge that we're meeting today on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So today we're very lucky to have Courtney, who is our brand new friend at the CHDH, and he's going to stay for the first day so that we can all find out what it is that he actually does. So his research studies how people around the world perceive, conceptualize, and engage with music, tracing the psychological and cultural roots of this diversity. So I think it's going to be really fun and cool talk. I've also heard that Courtney is a bird lover, so I will.
I guess I'm wearing a bird shirt. I just revealed.
Get into our underground movement to try to turn it into the complex bird data hub. So
oh yeah,
we'll be hearing about that today. But very excited to hear what Courtney's got to say. Please make him welcome.
yeah. So thanks everyone. Sorry for the slight delay. Hopefully there are no further technical difficulties. Sound is always a fun thing for Zoom. Yeah, so it's really great to be here, both here today, but also in the hub now, and in Melbourne. I've been in this role now for, I guess, about a month and a half. And for context, I guess, I mean, you just said this, but I'm here in a capacity as a ARC DECRA fellow. So I was lucky enough to get one of these early career grants that basically gives me funding to pursue my own independent research project over the next several years and to kind of kickstart my research career through that. So I'm really grateful for that opportunity. And I guess today is a good opportunity. This talk is a good opportunity to more fully introduce what it is I'll be doing over the next few years. There'll be a bit of context from reviewing where some of this has come from, but this is all pointing towards what I'm doing over the next few years. And one reason that it's good to share that is I hope to not just be doing this by myself in a corner, but to be kind of interacting with all of you and collaborating a bit. So yeah, this is a good opportunity to kind of get on the same page as to the kinds of things I'm thinking about and working on. So yeah. In particular, I guess, this talk is about one of the core ideas behind this DECRA project, which I guess I've summarized with the somewhat cryptic title, Citizen Science Psychology for Complexer Human Data. Yeah, in particular, this idea of citizen science psychology is a different way to think about engaging research participants is something I've been thinking about for a while now, and this project and kind of the work I'm doing over the next several years, I'm really motivated to explore and further develop this approach and the kinds of things it can offer us and how it can shed light on problems in new ways. Yeah, and so I guess a bit more of context here. So some of this thinking has come from my postdoc work, which I've been doing over the last 4.5 years, more or less, in the music lab. The director of the lab, Tamer, gave a talk here, I believe, a little while ago. Yeah, so I've been working in the lab for a while and doing a whole variety of different things, but one of the key responsibilities, roles in that work has been kind of developing, maintaining, and supporting aspects of this website, themusiclab.org, which you can all go visit if you'd like. The basic premise is to give people access to these kind of gamified little experiments about music perception. And doing this over several years, and both in terms of kind of designing and implementing some of these, and also just seeing what sort of data I can access through these kinds of studies has kind of excited me to the potential of, yeah, this slightly different way of thinking about participant recruitment. So that's a big part of the context here. And the work I plan to do going forward is really not to replicate necessarily what's been done here, but to really further develop this different way of recruiting participants into research in a few respects. I want to kind of move to a bit of a practical example now, and this is where there was difficulty with the sound, so apologies to online people. You may not hear the sound so much. I'm sure you'll kind of get the idea, but yeah, I'm going to play a little very simple pitch perception experiment test for you. you'll hear three tones, three pitches, and then a target pitch, which will either go up in pitch or down in pitch. And I'll ask you which you think it was. So let's start off nice and easy. So who thinks that went up in pitch? Anyone? No, down? All right, great. We don't have anyone that's profoundly tone deaf here. So great. But we can get a bit harder than that. That's quite a large pitch difference in terms of what people were, can commonly perceive. So let's make this a little bit harder and try again. Who thinks that went up? Anyone thinks went down? It went up. That's okay. Let's maybe get harder again. So let's do another one. Anyone think it went up? Anyone down? I think we had a majority of ups here. It was actually down. They are tricky. We'll do one more that's the maximum difficulty I think we have. Here we go.
Didn't do anything.
It's a trick question now. Anyone want to guess up? Guess down? All right. Was down. Good work. All right. So, out of interest here, who thinks they might be better than average at doing that kind of task? Raise your hands. Anyone thinks they're worse than average?
Yeah, above 40.
Well, it turns out a lot of people are quite interested in kind of doing this sort of really basic test. It's not particularly profound or interesting, but it's a simple thing that people are curious about seeing where they fall on a distribution here relative to the general population. And it turns out kind of crazily that we've been able to convince almost 2 million people to try this kind of test before. Which is pretty remarkable in some respects. And in introducing the idea of citizen science psychology, the one little nugget I want to focus on here for a second is that was possible through intrinsically motivated participation. And I'll be slowly building up what I kind of see as the citizen science approach, but I kind of see this intrinsically motivated participation as being one of the real key core parts of this. And just to elaborate briefly on what I mean by that and how that differs from other things you might be familiar with. So compared to something like Prolific, right, which many people here use, this is a paid for recruitment service. People in those studies are participating for extrinsic reasons, right? They don't necessarily really care about your particular research. They mostly care about getting a few dollars at the end of doing this study, hopefully without putting in too much effort. In this case, we're not giving these people any money. They're primarily interested in participating for intrinsic reasons that are, well, intrinsic to what we're looking at. So they're interested in seeing what their pitch perception abilities are like, and we're interested in finding out what their pitch perception abilities are like. So that's one characteristic. I'll come back to defining citizen science psychology in a bit more detail shortly, but that's, I think, one of the key insights. So this intrinsically motivated participation. With this, so I've titled the talk again, Citizen Science Psychology for Complexer Humana Data. So what do I mean by complexer data? One part of this is the potential for these bigger data sets. So obviously 2 million people is a lot of people. And even just on our site, that's not the only example. We've had several different studies that have had, close to 1 million people or hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of people. In other words, a much bigger scale than what's typically feasible to collect in the lab or even with something like Prolific. Another aspect, so just staying with this pitch perception experiment, and this is filtering to just the participants who completed the whole study and did all the demographic items, which is about only 1.3 million people. If you look at where they come from, there's a really long tail of countries that these people report as coming from. I'm only showing the top 10 here, and it's kind of unsurprising, I guess, for an English language site that the top 4 are the US, Canada, the UK, and Australia. But we have, I think it's over 100 countries that have at least 200 participants, I think is accurate. So in other words, there are a lot of countries represented, certainly not equally sampled, but there's a lot of diversity in where people are coming from. There's also a lot of diversity in the native languages people speak, despite the fact that this particular site's just in English. So there's various caveats to that, but there are many languages represented here, around about 100 to 200, depending on how you count them. Yes.
In the countries that had like 200 people, did it seem like someone did a lecture and showed people and everyone did it all at the same time, or is it just pretty random, people just found it?
So there's definitely like cases you can see where, like, for example, some influencer, social media person in a particular country and language maybe posted about this, and that got a whole bunch of people to, I remember at one point there was like some Turkish streamer or something like that like, did something about one of these games, and all of a sudden we had like, 20,000 people from Turkey on this study. So sometimes it's things like that. Other times, I mean, people come to the website through all sorts of different ways, often through large social media aggregation things like Reddit or like other social media platforms where, there are a majority of people from English-speaking countries, but also a lot of people from other countries as well. So, yeah. And I should say, generally, feel free to interrupt us. Like, I'm happy to answer questions. Yes.
So, can you tell, like, can people only do this once? I guess is the question.
So they can do it as many times as they want, but we keep track of whether they have done it a second time.
Okay.
Yes. In a couple different ways. One is asking them, but also we have some indirect ways to kind of get at that as well. And one thing I'll come back to later, in some more recent studies, this is a very old one, we've even encouraged people to do it again in a way that makes sense. Anyway, lots of countries, lots of languages, also a pretty good distribution of ages. There's certainly a skew towards younger people participating here. That's certainly evident. But nevertheless, like if you look up even around 50 years of age, we've still got like thousands of people per each of those groups. So there's a lot of information to work with in terms of variation over the lifespan. And I could go on, and I don't want to get caught up in that too much, but the point is, not only can you get bigger data sets, you can typically get more diverse data sets. And I also want to be clear, I don't mean sort of representatively totally diverse. These are definitely convenient samples of a sort. But nevertheless, they're far more diverse than typical kind of student samples in lab experiments or prolific samples and that sort of thing. Now, bigger is not always better. So you don't automatically learn new things just by having a bigger N. So, what can you do with bigger, diverser data? I want to give just a couple very brief examples. One is a new analysis, which I'm just looking at the moment, which is kind of fascinating. So on this pitch perception task that we have over 1 million participants for, we can look at country level variation while factoring out various sorts of control variables. And there's an interesting, quite strong correlation, a relatively small effect size, but with basically developmental, how developed a country is and the kind of socioeconomic conditions in those countries. Which on the one hand, there could be various kind of explanations such that people from wealthier countries tend to have higher quality sound on their devices. There's various ways that I think that maybe isn't the whole picture. The one thing that I've been quite interested in is the potential effect of socioeconomic conditions over childhood on the development of pitch perception. And this is a question with this big data set. So not only do we have many different countries, we have people's ages and the year that people did this test. And from that, we can infer the date they were born. And then using the World Bank socioeconomic developmental indicators, look at whether some of these indicators, particularly related to kind of child health and kind of exposure to developmental stresses, whether that explains these variation in later pitch perception abilities. And long story short, using what's called a distributed lag model analysis, we can see that like it does seem to be the case that early in the first 5 years of life, so just quickly interpreting this for you. So 0, this is the year that people were born. And what this shows is the effect of these socioeconomic conditions inferred from the World Bank indicators on the final outcome of their pitch perception abilities. And this is kind of cumulative in a certain sense. So the most of the math seems to be in the early years, implying a kind of sensitivity kind of window here. And there doesn't seem to be too much after that. There's a bit of a wiggle there, but this is maybe a bit easier to interpret if you look at a cumulative version of the same graph. So this is the same thing, but like adding up all the values as you go. And you can kind of see that like the effect of these socioeconomic conditions seems to like max out its predictive value after about 5 years of age and is more or less stable after that. I don't want to get too stuck in on this particular example, but I just wanted to use this as an example of the sort of thing you can do with these much bigger, more diverse data sets that would just be completely inconceivable in an ordinary lab-based study. Another quick example from a published example of mine is we used the fact that we had many different languages sampled in a separate experiment to look at the effect of your native language on your music perception abilities. And very briefly, so there are 3 different measures here. There's a measure seeing how good you are at discriminating melody patterns, so patterns in pitch and melody. There's a measure of how good you're discriminating small pitch differences in the tuning of a voice in a singer, for example. And there's a measure testing how good you are at discriminating whether a rhythm is in time with the beat or not. And the fascinating thing here that you can see kind of quite robustly is that if you speak a tonal language like Mandarin, Thai, Vietnamese, several African languages like Yoruba, you tend to be at the top end of the distribution for melodic discrimination and the bottom end of the distribution for beat alignment. And very briefly, we interpret that as a kind of feature-specific attentional trade-off that's motivated by your linguistic environment. And this, again, is something that is uniquely possible to look at this scale with that kind of data. Yeah. So it's kind of maybe the simple version that's not exactly right. And it's like a bit of a contested, like, is this a separate category or not kind of question? But it's kind of like an intermediate between a kind of non-tonal language like English and a tonal language like Mandarin. I believe some languages like, I think it's even some dialects of Japanese, so Tokyo dialect has a pitch accent. So in other words, the meaning of a certain word will depend on a particular stressed kind of pitch accent, but not in the same complex way as Mandarin, where like the exact pitch contour, there'll be like many different contours that could be reflected in different words. So a classic example of Mandarin is like, and I don't really speak Mandarin, but like ma, that sort of thing. Sorry for butchering Mandarin for any speakers, but those different ma sounds are different words. Anyway, so that's that example there. So summarizing a bit of that, so we can get bigger data sets, more diverse data sets. We can also look at these new complex data questions, and I think that's something that's quite interesting. And yeah, so another aspect, more money, more problems, or in this case, more data, more problems. With these bigger and more complex data sets, there's opportunities to explore kind of more complex forms of modeling and statistical analysis, but there's also a lot of challenges associated with that. So for example, if you have 1 million participants worth of data, our raw data file is something like 80 gigabytes, and you have to handle that in a different way that you do a study where you've got like, a few dozen participants. Another example, so for this pitch discrimination test, we wanted to fit a drift diffusion model to this to basically interpret the drift rate parameters as a measure of sensitivity to pitch. My colleague Josh initially tried to run a sort of Bayesian hierarchical drift diffusion thing for this data for just a subset of 5,000 participants on a big compute cluster with 112 cores and 2 weeks of compute time. That still wasn't sufficient to fit that. So there's no way that was going to scale up to, 1.2, 1.3 million participants. So that led me on a bit of a goose chase, checking out some of these modern Bayesian techniques, in particular, what's called amortized Bayesian inference. For anyone unfamiliar, I don't have time to get into details, but it's basically using neural networks to help estimate Bayesian models and making them more computationally efficient. There are all sorts of challenges with that, but when it works, you can do some amazing stuff. And this paid off in our case because we're able to estimate all 1.2 million participants worth of data. I'm not going to get into the details of that too much, but this is kind of an example of how having bigger data sets, more diverse data sets, and complex data questions motivates new ways of analyzing data that can come with new challenges, but also come with new opportunities about like the sorts of things that we can estimate or look at. Yeah. Take a sip of water in case anyone has any questions. Right. One kind of, I guess, final aspect of characterizing what I mean by complexer data here. Again, coming back to this pitch discrimination task. So this task is incredibly simple, very simplistic. There are 3 reference tones, a target tone, people respond up or down, and we give them feedback. And in this case, there are just 6 different conditions for how small that pitch interval is in log-spaced units. Each participant receives an equal number of trials for each of those conditions. And that's it, incredibly simple. It's kind of remarkable we're able to get so much out of just that. But what I'm really interested in with this citizen science approach is not just taking something like this that you could run in the lab with a couple dozen students, but like what sorts of things can we design and measure when we are planning for these larger sample sizes? So, what can an experiment look like if it has 1 million participants? How would you design it differently? And there are lots of different ways to analyze that. One idea, I see Dan Little is on Zoom. There's a paper that he's a co-author on, which I found quite interesting from several years ago, led by Beth Baribeau. And if you're not familiar with this, the basic idea is that in kind of replication studies, one interesting idea is to not just replicate the study exactly, but maybe across different kind of groups, you could vary different parameters of the experiment, such as the timing of something, the size of something, the color, all these different ways of operationalizing your experiment. And then using modern multi-level Bayesian modeling, you can not only have an overall estimate of what your experimental effect is, but then look at how well this generalizes across these different factors and thereby better understand what it is you're looking at and how it will generalize perhaps to different situations. Something like that, I think, is a really great idea to apply to these big data sets. So if you're designing something knowing that you're going to get a large sample size, perhaps this was implemented by Sam and some students 5 or so years ago. If I redid this today, I might do things like vary across participants what that reference pitch starts at, the timing between these tones, whether that's jittered, there's a whole number of different things you could look at and see whether the overall effects are robust to those differences and so on. One idea that I have experimented with, a more recent study that I designed is this tone guesser game. This, in short, is about studying the structure of musical pitch. So, what makes one pitch sound like it fits in with a melody, and another pitch sounds like it's a kind of a wrong note or stands out. That's kind of what this is about. I'm not going to go into the details here, but the key idea is that knowing that I had the potential for a large sample size, I designed this in a way to take advantage of that. So basically, you can see these matrices here. Each one of these represents one song stimulus. So for example, and then what we were interested in is if we gave people a tone relative, a particular pitch relative to that musical example, how well would they think that fits in with that melody? And we wanted to do this in a pairwise way for various reasons. For example, and compare that to so I won't survey you, but you might have some intuition about which of those tones fitted the song better, in some respect. But the point I'm kind of illustrating here is this is one song. That's one of 132 possible pairs of tones. And then we had 80 different songs sampled. So all of this ends up being over 10,000 unique stimulus combinations, which would be kind of insane to look at in an ordinary lab-based study. But knowing that we had the potential for a larger sample size, and knowing that this kind of approach had certain theoretical motivations that might make it interesting to do this, that was kind of the motivation for designing the experiment in this way. Yeah. So bigger data sets, more diverse data sets, new complex data questions, new ways of analyzing data, and new potential ways of thinking of designing our measures or what our experiments are. So give me another time. So far I've given maybe a kind of rough taste of what I mean by citizen science psychology here, and talked a bit about its potential benefits for complexer data in all the respects I just talked about. I want to briefly think about what I mean by humaner data here. So yeah, what do I mean by humaner data? I think designing a citizen science sort of style study, and I've been reflecting on this a lot over the last kind of several years. I think a key part of it is more fully recognizing human agency and trying to develop a more of a cooperative relationship with them as a research participant, as opposed to something like Prolific, where I think it's a bit more of a transactional relationship. In a certain sense, and I'm not saying this as a kind of ethical criticism of Prolific, but in a certain sense, when you're buying participant time on something like that, you kind of it's like buying a resource. It's like buying I don't know, some lab equipment or something like that. You don't have to think about what the motivations of those participants are, what will kind of engage them. You just, put the money out there and the participants do the task. A citizen science approach kind of requires you to think a bit more deeply about how to engage these participants and to think about them as having choices over what they do, how long they do something for, what particular version of something they do. And I think the cooperative angle in particular, it's kind of having a more honest relationship with them that, you're trying to have them get something out of this in the same way that you're getting something out of this. And I think this is one of the reasons why you can get bigger data, for example. Not only might these participants be more motivated if you pull this off, but you don't have to, give them compensation, money to do this because they're getting something else out of it already. If I had to give even just a single dollar to every participant who did the pitch discrimination task, would be broke. That's one aspect of it. But another, I think, quite interesting aspect is I think this approach also inherently ends up promoting higher quality data. And I guess what I mean by that is if you think about the challenges we have on services like Prolific with data quality, almost always the kind of root cause of that is this misalignment between the motivations, right? The participant, their motivation is to get through your task with the least effort possible. Maybe that's the worst case, and to get their money at the end. And you want to get good data and learn about that phenomena, but there's a misalignment there. The idea with a citizen science study is you try and design something that aligns the motivations of both parties such that the participant cares about providing good quality data because they are getting something out of that data being higher quality. They're learning more about themselves, for example. Yeah, I'll be quite interested to kind of, I don't think anyone's really explored this empirically to test that it's high quality data, and I think that would be an interesting kind of direction to do. But I think just logically, like, I don't know if anyone disagrees, but like, I think the logic there is that you often get high quality data, and that's been my experience with this kind of style of recruiting previously. If someone is not motivated, if they find your study boring, they're just not going to do it, right? Another aspect of a kind of more citizen science approach, I think, is that it's a bit more kind of civic minded. And I guess this is something that I think about more and more with our kind of increasingly fragmented world and kind of distrust in science and this sort of thing. And I think a citizen science style of recruiting has the potential to not only engage in science communication at a larger scale, but to also really make experiences with science a bit more accessible. And, even if it's, nothing particularly profound, just giving more people experience of interacting in some way with scientific institutions and hopefully having positive experiences from that. I'm certainly under no illusions this is going to solve all the problems we have in the world right now, but like I'm increasingly thinking about how this sort of approach to participation could have these broader kind of benefits as well, and thinking about how we can design for that. Yeah, so I guess this all leads me to the work I'm really doing over the next few years, which is designing a new citizen science platform to do this kind of research. And I want to lay out, I guess, so sorry, I'm just realizing that this bar is kind of in the way, but anyway. I want to lay out a few of the kind of high level values, I guess, that are guiding my approach here. So like in this talk, I'm not going to give the specifics yet. I'm still kind of developing and building this, but I want to give the high level values that I see as guiding the kind of platform I want to build here, and I guess the reasons for those. One of those is I want to design for kind of participant agency. So not only giving people choice about like what kinds of little studies or measures that they do, but giving them ways to choose how much they participate. So there's going to be some broad population of participants who might be okay doing a couple minutes of like a particular measure or study to get some idea. Maybe they're not super motivated, but they'll kind of, maybe do that if you frame it to them the right way. But there's always going to be some subset of the population who are really interested in a particular phenomenon and are willing to invest more time in learning about that. And I've been quite interested in the idea of designing measures and experiments that accommodate that kind of choice about, one person choosing to participate more than another. Obviously, a complication of this is that the kind of person that participates more is probably not the same kind of person that participates less. But this is where having more sophisticated analysis and kind of embracing that complexity, I think, can make that still viable, and we can get new information about kind of sampling some aspects of something really deeply within participants, while at the same time having broad sampling as well, maybe in a coarser sense. And this can be facilitated by a kind of multi-level style modeling, I think. So that's one part, so designing for participant agency. I also want to design this kind of platform in this cooperative kind of framing where, the transaction is kind of as really honest as it can be. So, we're trying to motivate, excite people to be curious about certain aspects of their psychology or how they perceive music or engage in music. And we're trying to guide them through the process of, if you do these kind of tasks or surveys, like what you can learn from doing that, and kind of being honest about that, trying to find accessible ways to communicate uncertainty in things, And related to the first part, given uncertainty in how much you can learn from a certain amount of data, maybe that might motivate them to contribute more data to resolve that uncertainty and to learn more about something they care about. Another part is I want to design for long-term engagement. So the Music Lab website, for the most part, is based on kind of like one-time interactions with participants. And I think that's a really viable strategy in the sense that it's quite simple and people can just be excited about one thing and do that thing. I'm really interested in developing an approach that tries to build a longer-term relationship with these participants and helps them kind of accumulate and curate their own data about themselves, which does a couple things. I think it can both be meaningful to the participant, but it also then helps us link data across different measures and potentially over time in a really rich way that adds more, I think, valuable complexity to this. And that kind of gets to this other point. So I want this platform to kind of be built around interlinking these data sets. So, I want to be able to link across measures, across time, and build these more nuanced pictures of kind of individual variation and how different psychological or musical behavioral things kind of correlate with each other within a person and across people. Another bit, and this is partly inspired by some work I've seen here from, there's a really interesting paper led by Simon Dennis of the Hub here, and also including, I think, several other people here. I think it's called like Privacy versus Open Science. Yeah, which I find really interesting and stimulating kind of discussion of these ideas. And I'm still not entirely sure where I land on this exactly for how I'm implementing this, but I'm really interested in this idea of giving participants a greater sense of ownership over their own data. And I think that's especially important when we're developing these like more complex interlinked over time data sets. Giving participants greater autonomy over that and sense of ownership, and that this is a valuable thing that they're curating about themselves. And by sharing this with science, we can all learn together, but giving them some agency in that. Another aspect is I want to design for kind of breadth of topics. So I don't really want to just focus on music specific things. For reasons I'll elaborate in a second, I'm very interested in how different psychological or cultural factors or other sorts of things kind of interlink and explain variation. So, I want to have personality measures, attentional things, like all sorts of individual differences, kind of, and seeing how all these things kind of link in with each other. And I think that also has the benefit of, if you just have a music sort of citizen science thing, that might be really attractive to people who are interested in music, but maybe less so in other areas. So I think by catering to a breadth of topics in a certain sense, you're potentially providing more avenues into the platform for an initial point of interest. And finally, I'm quite interested in this kind of designing for a positive civic contribution of these kind of platforms. I'm just keeping an eye on time. I'm trying to wrap up so we've got time for questions. I guess this is the kind of values I see as guiding the kind of platform I want to build in the next few months and years. And I guess finally, I want to kind of frame how this ultimately fits into my research program and the things I'm interested in. So there's a reason why I've spoken mostly here about the citizen science and the methods and all this sort of thing, and haven't talked too much about my specific research aims in music. And one of those reasons is that these methods, the kind of citizen science approach with the bigger data, more diverse data, linked data, and the kind of more sophisticated ways of analyzing data, these things motivate the kinds of questions that I want to look at, which is primarily looking at kind of diversity and differences in how people perceive, engage with, and conceptualize music, and the different cultural and psychological factors that might explain that diversity. And that's inherently a type of question that you need to look at across different kinds of phenomena and at least sample relatively diverse large samples to see those differences, some of which might be small differences, but still important. So I very much see, and this is kind of congealed over time, if you like, this kind of synergy or kind of harmony between these different elements, which I think comprise what I'm interested in. It's having this newer form of citizen science, way of collecting data, which facilitates more sophisticated analyses. And then those things then enable me to look at these kinds of questions about music, which would be really hard to look at in another way. So I guess kind of summarizing that, and as a final point, I want to tell a joke which one of my old mentors always used to tell about other things. So a police officer was walking around at night and sees a drunk person groveling around on the floor under a lamplight, kind of looking pretty confused. So the police officer goes up and asks this person, like, what are you doing? Like, can I help? The person says, I lost my glasses. Can you help me look for them? The police officer says, like, sure, like, where did you last see your glasses? And the drunk says, over in the park in the dark over there. And the police officer then responds kind of puzzled, why are you looking under this like lamppost? And the drunk responds, well, that's where I can see things. So, the analogy there is for me to look at the kind of questions that I'm interested in here. I think it would be really hard for me to do that if I was just doing that in small lab-based studies. And kind of reflecting on all this over the last like several years, it's really driven home to me how much our methods constrain the kind of questions we ask, how we analyze data, and that sometimes like trying to explore new ways of collecting data can inspire new questions and new ways of looking at that data. So thanks to Australian government, appreciate it. Also, a big thank you to Evan Kidd. So I think Evan gave a talk here not too long ago. And Evan, as I was writing this grant, provided a lot of feedback and mentoring and support. So I want to thank him there as well. And yeah, thanks for your attention and look forward to your questions. Piers.
That's a fun talk and very inspiring, and I should apologize, I'm obviously going to have to rush off to another lecture, but it's not that.
Yep, no problem.
But quick, those are huge data sets. You're not paying for them, fabulous. How long does it take to collect them?
It varies. So the big pitch discrimination one I was talking about, that's been collecting data for 5 years. But so for instance, let's see, let's go back to like this one, which is more recent. And I should clarify, about 30,000 of those participants have done the full long version of that experiment. That's been collecting data for about a year. And this can vary a lot. So like, obviously, if you happen to design something that really engages people and, it goes viral on social media, you can have like 100,000 participants in a couple days. Like that can happen. Other times, it's just a slow churn. So it varies a lot, I think. And some of that's luck. Some of that, I think, is designing these things in the right way to be engaging and kind of shareable and all of those things. Yeah.
Yeah, I have like a question following up with that, which is with the new kind of platform you're building and everything, how do you kind of plan to go about distribution? Because I kind of think like, I'd love to do this, but I don't know how I would get 1 million people to do my experiment when I have like, 100 followers on Blue Sky.
Right.
So where do I find 1 million people?
Yeah. I mean, that's inherently a tricky thing. So, I mean, for part of the context, the Music Lab site and the work we've been doing there, we've never paid for like advertising or anything like that. It's all being word of mouth, which isn't to say that if you design something and put it up on the internet, all of a sudden you're going to have like 1 million people on there. You do need to think about ways that, you could engage particular audiences and again, just like let's see. Somewhere around here. just even things like providing ways for people to share things on social media, it can often be a really good way to snowball recruitment. So yeah, there's no guarantees, and probably it's realistic, like when initially launching a study like this, to not expect 1 million participants. But yeah, I think a lot of the design is thinking about deeply like what is actually engaging and kind of meaningful to people. Like if you're just putting up an experiment that you're previously running in Prolific, maybe not many people are going to engage with it. Like it's probably not the most engaging thing. So like in my experience, when we're designing these studies, there's a lot more time just iterating and kind of getting random people we know to try it out and asking them like, was this interesting? Like, are there any bits that were confusing? That sort of thing. So yeah.
I have two questions. One is, how does ethics go with sort of doing something like this? And then I guess the second one is, you mentioned, like, it's great that you're here in the Complex Human Data Hub. The thing I kept wondering was, what would be your desired way of, interacting with people on this, right? Like, do you sort of, I can see lots of things that I don't want to put words in your mouth, so, yeah.
Yeah, so regarding ethics, to be determined for the new stuff here. So I'm working on that, and we'll see how much of a challenge that is. Obviously, like it's a much more complex kind of interdependent system than the kind of data collection that perhaps ethics boards are used to. But at the same time, I think for the same reasons that, I kind of motivate the humaner parts of this data, I think a lot of this has good ethical sides of this, which like, I don't know if we'll convince worried ethics boards about some of the complexities of this, but yeah. And then what we've previously done on the music lab, that there's an old ethics protocol that's been going for like 5 years, which has made things easier. But yeah. And then the second part of your question, so do you mean how would I engage collaborators or participants, or?
I mean, like, so again, this is mainly, in hat as director, do I encourage collaborations and people to work together, right? Are you sort of, because you mentioned that you want to build this platform and it'd be cool to not have music stuff in it.
Yeah.
Are you interested in working with people who might have things they want to try on there?
Yeah.
Or you have plenty of things you want to try, and you want to work with people on data analysis, or
Yeah, absolutely.
sort of people to admire you from afar.
Definitely the latter. But I guess the short version is that I would see, like, I'm really open to collaboration. So like reach out if you've got any ideas, but like I wouldn't necessarily frame that collaboration as like, if you have a study, you can just like put it up on there's a long process in like thinking about, does this really make sense? How do we design it in a way that really fits like what's going there? Because I think it has to work as a whole. It has to be kind of coherent. There's more work than your average study in kind of making that bit of it work. So if people have ideas, I'm really open to them, but it may be a bit of a process to figure out the best way to like kind of translate that into something on the side. But I'm definitely open to that. Yeah.
This is really interesting. I thought the point about data quality and motivation was really, and again, see what you think about this. You may agree with this. I think with this kind of platform, your motivation you're getting is likely to be more varied. So with like data quality, but data platform like Prolific, you kind of know that everyone has a single motivation to make money, which is nice. But with this kind of platform, you get people who are you're likely to get people who are intrinsically motivated. They are because they have some value or they're trying to learn something about themselves. But I guess you're also likely to get a wide variety of people who are just messing around. Maybe you get bots or like coordinated manipulation as well. And I don't know, what do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I mean, this is definitely like a really important thing to think about. Like, I mean, just briefly on things like bots and whatnot, I've done a lot of looking at the music lab data to try and see whether we've got any evidence of that. And for the most part, we don't. And I think a really important reason is there's just no financial incentive to like, we're not handing out money, like there's no kind of tangible kind of benefit outside of the intrinsic thing of finding out more about yourself. And it's definitely true. People's motivations can be really varied, and I think that itself can be a really interesting thing to study, maybe to see even how that moderates certain things that we're studying. But fundamentally, if someone's like not engaged enough to like do the task, they're just going to close their browser tab, right? So I think in a certain sense that becomes a selection bias issue potentially, but it's kind of defends against that kind of data quality issue where like someone is just clicking through because they want to get their money at the end. In this case, all they're going to be getting is, you know, some lousy summary of their result of clicking through to the end, right? So, yeah.
Just to comment on the ethics issue, I did a citizen science thing with the ABC a few years ago. And it was surprisingly easy. I thought it was going to be a nightmare.
Right.
So I think you can.
I'll be interested to talk to you about that. Yeah.
So I thought it was and maybe the fact that with the ABC as well.
Right.
As long as you don't ask me anything, you know,
Sensitive.
really
Yeah.
automatic, actually that it's not so bad.
Right. Yeah.
Unusual to say about that.
That's good to hear.
Yeah.
Can I ask about the chart based on the World Bank indicators?
Yes.
Yeah, actually, maybe the next one.
Oh.
Yeah, I found this really interesting. Can you say a bit more about what does it mean for there to be an effect left of the 0 line?
Yeah. So there are a couple potential aspects of that. One is inherently it's kind of like fitting a spline model here. So some part of that could just be some like imprecision about how this is capturing it, and it's kind of spilling over the adjacent years. But there's also actually a sensible story to tell about how country level socioeconomic indicators before you're born actually affect your affect things that come later. This is quite common actually in kind of developmental economics that use these kinds of things, because the conditions of a country at a aggregate level kind of take a while to trickle down to certain pockets of the population and have tangible effects. So if certain conditions improve like a few years before someone's born, that maybe improves the mother's health, various kind of hospital support that's available, other sorts of things. So I think there are plausible reasons to maybe predict there would be a bit of overlap there, is kind of my thinking. Does that kind of make sense? Yep.
Very cool. From a data privacy perspective, with your participants, how can they retract their data if they need to?
So currently on the Music Lab platform, I don't think there's a way for them to do it. I could be wrong actually. Anyway, what I plan to do for my platform is unlike what's on the Music Lab, for people to basically have accounts on this website that would enable them to have recurring ways for them, through authentication to kind of have some form of access in their data. And this will come to how I frame things to ethics and how we kind of initially pitch this to participants. But I want them to be able to have options of retracting data. Obviously, if something's already been published, that's like that ship sailed. But like, the idea is to basically have a kind of like dashboard page where people can see visualizations about their data and kind of get ideas about what things they might want to do next. But they can also then like look at some specific aspect of the data and decide, okay, I don't want to share that anymore. And because of the way I'm planning to structure the database, it would be possible to like, drop that or kind of like flag that in a way that it won't be used for analysis. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just a lurker here from the spatial group here. Really interesting. I was wondering how you're planning to deal with different legal environments, the GDPR and all this sort of stuff. Relates to this question as well.
Yeah.
But also the load on managing the platform. So I've been talking a fair bit to people that run C0 Quest, like C0 Quest.
A little bit.
And there the complexity was even increased to the head and a half. And they really ran out of funding, and like, whenever there's a library that gets updated somewhere, you have to push security updates to iPhones and that's really a disaster.
Yes.
But even with what you're planning here, it's going to be a fair low, right? As soon as you start having accounts and a lot of it's way more complex than people
Mhm.
currently.
Yeah, no, this is a really important part of it. Certainly I'm sticking away from having a separate app. Like I've also had a bit of experience with that, and I know how much of a nightmare that is, and you need resources like dedicated people to kind of handle that. My thinking about the practicalities of all this is really informed by like me having done a lot of the technical back-end work for the music lab over the last several years. So I've kind of developed the experience, technical knowledge, and kind of expectations about how at least that system works. The one I'm planning to build will be a little bit more complicated in some ways, for sure. But yeah, ultimately, I think that's still manageable for what I'm aiming to do. And yeah, it's that kind of maintainability aspect of it is certainly like a really important practical consideration for sure.